My husband looked straight at me during dinner and said, "You're mediocre, Claire. You've always been mediocre." For a moment, the room felt completely silent. My fork stopped in my hand and I just stared at him, wondering if I heard him right. We had been married for 12 years, and in that moment it felt like I was sitting across from a stranger. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Claire Dalton. I met my husband, Grant, when we were both young and trying to build our lives. Back then he was kind, funny, and full of big dreams. I believed in him from the very beginning. When his first business idea failed, I worked extra hours to help us pay the bills. When he wanted to change careers, I supported him again. Slowly things started to change. As Grant became more successful at work, his attitude toward me began to shift. At first it was small comments. He would say I thought too small or that I lacked ambition. I tried to ignore it and told myself he was just stressed from work. But that night at dinner felt different. The way he said the word mediocre was calm and cold, like it was something he had believed for a long time. I realized he didn't see me as the woman who helped him build his life. In his mind, I was just someone ordinary standing next to his success. I didn't argue with him that night. I didn't shout or cry. Instead, I sat quietly and thought about the last 12 years. I remembered every sacrifice I made and every dream I pushed aside to support our marriage. And for the first time in a long time, I asked myself a simple question. What would happen if I stopped trying to prove my worth to him, and started proving it to myself? My name is Claire Dalton. 12 years ago, I stood in a small courthouse and promised my life to Grant Dalton. At that time, everything about our future felt hopeful and bright. We first crossed paths in Portland during a community event. Grant had an easy smile and a way of speaking that made people listen. He talked about goals, new ideas, and the kind of future he wanted to build. His confidence drew me in, and I admired the way he believed he could achieve something meaningful. In those early days, life felt simple. We rented a modest apartment near the river and filled it with second-hand furniture and laughter. Money was tight, but we didn't worry much about that. We were young and convinced that hard work would eventually open the right doors. Grant often stayed awake late at night working on plans and proposals. I would bring him coffee and sit nearby while he talked about possibilities. Listening to him felt exciting because it seemed like we were building something together. While he explored different paths, I focused on stability. I kept regular employment so our bills were always paid on time. Some months were difficult, yet I never complained because I believed in what we were creating as a couple. There were times when Grant questioned his direction. Projects failed, interviews ended without offers, and setbacks appeared more than once. During those moments I reminded him that progress rarely comes quickly. I encouraged him to keep trying until something finally worked. Years passed, and our routine slowly formed. We celebrated small victories and kept pushing through challenges that appeared along the way. Through it all, I held on to one belief: a strong partnership means facing struggles side by side rather than giving up when things become complicated. Looking back now, those early years shaped the foundation of our life. I believed loyalty and patience would always hold us together. However, as time moved forward, subtle shifts began to appear in Grant's attitude. The warmth that once defined him slowly faded, replaced by something colder I couldn't quite understand. At first I tried to ignore it, hoping it was only temporary pressure from work and responsibilities. But deep down, I could sense that the man I once knew was gradually becoming someone very different. Change rarely arrives all at once. In our case, it crept in quietly, almost unnoticed at first. The warmth that once filled our conversations slowly faded, replaced by remarks that felt sharper than before. Grant began making passing statements that seemed harmless on the surface. One evening while discussing future plans, he shrugged and said, "Claire, you think too small." He said it casually, like it was simple advice. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself he didn't mean anything by it. A few weeks later, another moment came. We were talking about opportunities at work when he looked at me and said, "Claire, you're not really leadership material." His tone sounded calm, almost analytical, as if he were describing a fact instead of speaking about his wife. I felt the sting of those words but pushed the feeling aside. I told myself everyone has rough days. Grant had been spending more hours at the office, and pressure can change how people speak. I convinced myself the comments were only frustration slipping out. As months passed, his confidence grew along with his position at the company. Each new advancement seemed to make him stand a little taller and speak a little differently. The humility that once made him grateful slowly disappeared. The man who used to thank me for believing in him began acting as if my support had never mattered. Sometimes when I shared an idea or suggestion, he dismissed it before I could finish. Other times he responded with a quiet sigh that made me feel as if I had said something foolish. Even with those moments, I tried to remain patient. I reminded myself of everything we had built together. I believed loyalty meant staying steady when the person you love goes through changes. So I kept encouraging him, listening to his stories from work, and celebrating his achievements. I told myself this phase would pass and that the thoughtful man I once knew would return. For a long time, I accepted those small cuts in silence. Until one evening when his words crossed a line that could never be ignored. That was the night he looked straight at me and called me mediocre. 7 days passed after that painful evening. I moved through the house quietly, still thinking about his words and trying to understand what had truly changed between us. A strange distance filled the air, like we were living in separate worlds under the same roof. One night I walked down the hallway and heard Grant speaking in the living room. His voice was low, almost secretive. I had no intention of listening, but when I heard another woman's name, my steps stopped without thinking. He was speaking with a coworker named Elena Brooks. At first the conversation sounded casual, like two people discussing work matters. Then his tone softened in a way I hadn't heard in years. Something about it made my chest tighten. I stayed still, hidden around the corner, unable to move. Grant began talking about his life, about the future he wanted. But the way he described things felt unfamiliar, like he was telling a story that no longer included me. Then I heard a sentence that made everything suddenly clear. He said he felt like he was outgrowing his marriage. The words didn't sound angry or emotional. They sounded calm, almost relieved, as if he had already decided something important. My heart pounded as I listened. Elena said something I couldn't fully hear, and Grant answered with a quiet laugh. The sound carried through the hallway, light and easy. Then he said something else, a sentence that froze me in place. "Claire's comfortable. Safe. But she's never going to be extraordinary." For a moment I felt completely numb. I stood there staring at the wall, trying to process what I had just heard. He wasn't just frustrated with me. He had already begun separating his life from mine, speaking about our relationship as if it were something holding him back. In that moment I understood something painful but important. The man I had stood beside for more than a decade no longer saw me as a partner in his future. I quietly walked back to the bedroom and closed the door behind me. Something deep inside me shifted that night. The sadness was still there, but another feeling began to grow beside it. A quiet realization that everything between us had already changed. I said nothing after that discovery. No arguments, no emotional scene, no sudden accusations. I continued my daily routine as if everything were normal. On the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. Inside, however, my thoughts were moving in a completely different direction. Instead of reacting immediately, I began paying close attention to everything around me. I noticed the way Grant carried himself when he spoke about work, the way he looked at his phone when messages arrived, and the distant tone that had become part of his everyday conversation. Observing quietly gave me clarity. For many nights I sat alone thinking about the past years of our life together. One memory after another came back to me. Moments when I chose stability so he could explore new opportunities. Times when I adjusted my own plans so his ambitions could move forward without obstacles. I remembered declining training programs that could have advanced my own career. I remembered turning down relocation offers because his job required us to stay in the same city. I remembered long hours working to keep our finances steady while he experimented with new paths. Back then, those choices felt natural. Supporting the person you love seemed like the right thing to do. I believed success shared between two people would always feel meaningful. But now I began see things differently. Those years of support had slowly pushed my own goals into the background. Without noticing it, I had built my life around someone else's progress while leaving little room for my own growth. This realization did not arrive with anger. Instead, it came with a calm understanding that surprised even me. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a simple but powerful question. What would my future look like if I finally placed my own well-being at the center of my decisions? The idea felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable. Yet the more I thought about it, the clearer everything became. That evening I sat at the kitchen table long after Grant had gone to sleep. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. In that quiet moment, I made a decision. I would not remain in a life where I was treated as an afterthought. Instead of waiting for him to leave, I began carefully preparing a path forward for myself. Soon after making that silent commitment to change my direction, I took a step I had delayed for many seasons. Years earlier I had once considered earning an advanced qualification that could open better professional paths, but I had placed the idea aside while focusing on our household responsibilities. Now I finally registered for that program. The schedule demanded discipline. Classes required careful attention, assignments needed long hours, and exams pushed me to learn skills I had never fully developed before. At first it felt overwhelming, yet there was also a strange sense of excitement that I hadn't experienced for a very long period. During this time Grant spent many days traveling for his job. Whenever he returned, he often talked about meetings, company achievements, and how well everything was progressing for him. I listened politely, giving the same calm responses he expected, but my attention was no longer centered on his world. After dinner, once the house became quiet, I opened my books and focused completely on my own progress. Some nights stretched far past midnight. The work required patience, but every chapter one completed gave me a small sense of accomplishment. Gradually, something began to shift inside me. The doubts that had once settled in my mind started to fade. Learning new material strengthened my confidence little by little. I began to remember that growth does not disappear simply because someone else fails to see it. Months passed, and the routine became part of my daily life. Each exam I passed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been forgotten. By the end of the first year, the effort had changed more than my resume. It had changed how I viewed my future. I felt movement again. The feeling was powerful, like standing at the beginning of a road that had been hidden for a long time. Instead of standing still, I was finally moving forward with purpose. Not long after that progress began, something else appeared, an unexpected opening that would soon place my abilities in front of people who valued them. Not long after finishing that demanding program, an unexpected development appeared. One afternoon I received a message inviting me to discuss a potential role with a respected consulting organization called Hawthorne Advisory. At first I assumed it might only be an informal conversation, but the meeting quickly turned into something much more serious. The interview process moved faster than I expected. The partners seemed interested in the projects I had completed during my training and the way I approached problem solving. Instead of doubting my abilities, they asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to my ideas. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely respected in a professional conversation. A few days later they called again with an official proposal. The compensation was far higher than anything I had earned before, almost twice the income from my previous position. Along with the financial improvement came challenging assignments and the chance to work with experienced professionals across different industries. When I accepted the offer, I felt a quiet sense of pride. The long nights of preparation had finally led somewhere meaningful. That evening I shared the news with Grant. I expected at least a small sign of encouragement, maybe even curiosity about the opportunity. Instead, his reaction surprised me. He leaned back in his chair and let out a short laugh. "Consulting?" he said with a half-smile. "That sounds ambitious for you." The words were not loud or angry. They carried the same dismissive tone I had grown used to hearing. In his mind, my progress still didn't seem important. For a moment I considered explaining how serious the position was and how much work it had taken to reach this point. But then I paused. There was no reason to argue or seek validation. Grant had already formed his opinion about who I was. Changing his view was no longer my responsibility. So I simply nodded, finished my meal, and moved on with the evening. Inside, I felt calm. If he believed I would never rise beyond his expectations, that was his choice. I decided it was better to let my future speak for itself. Time continued moving forward, and with it came changes neither of us had expected. During the next 2 years, my professional path expanded faster than I imagined possible. Each assignment brought new responsibilities and new challenges. Instead of observing from the sidelines, I was now coordinating complex projects that required planning, leadership, and constant decision-making. My work also required frequent travel. I began visiting different cities, meeting clients face-to-face, and solving problems that carried real consequences for large organizations. Every completed contract strengthened my credibility within the firm. Colleagues trusted my judgment. Senior partners relied on my reports. Gradually my name began circulating in professional circles as someone capable of handling difficult situations with calm focus. What surprised me most was how natural it all felt. The skills I had quietly developed during those long months of preparation were finally being used in ways that mattered. While my responsibilities continued expanding, Grant's situation began shifting in a very different direction. His company entered a period of internal restructuring. Departments merged, leadership changed, and several advancement opportunities disappeared. The fast upward movement he once enjoyed suddenly slowed. Instead of celebrating new achievements, his conversations at home became shorter and more cautious. I noticed the frustration in his voice when he spoke about office decisions that were no longer in his control. For the first time since the beginning of our relationship, the balance between us was changing. Years earlier I had stood in the background supporting his ambitions. Now my schedule filled with meetings, planning sessions, and travel arrangements while he spent more evenings quietly reviewing reports from work. I never mentioned the contrast between our situations. There was no reason to turn success into competition. Yet it was impossible to ignore the shift happening in our daily life. Grant began observing me differently. Sometimes he watched as I packed for another business trip or answered a late phone call about a project deadline. There was a new expression in his eyes, one I had never seen before. It looked like realization slowly forming. One quiet evening we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The house was calm, and neither of us had spoken for several minutes. Grant studied my face for a moment before finally breaking the silence. "You've changed," he said softly. The words hung in the air between us. His tone wasn't mocking or dismissive the way it used to be. Instead, it carried a sense of uncertainty, almost as if he were trying to understand something that had slowly shifted without him noticing. I looked at him and realized he was right. The person sitting in that chair was no longer the same woman who had once tried so hard to earn his approval. For many years I had measured my confidence through his opinions, hoping that encouragement from him would make me feel valued. Somewhere along the way, that habit disappeared. The long nights of effort, the professional challenges, and the quiet determination to rebuild my life had changed how I saw myself. My sense of purpose no longer depended on whether he believed in me. I also stopped trying to protect a relationship that had already begun fading long ago. For too long I had tried to keep peace by ignoring uncomfortable truths. Now I understood that real respect cannot exist in a place where one person constantly feels diminished. Grant watched me carefully, waiting for a response. Instead of explaining everything I had learned over the past years, I simply gave a small nod. Words felt unnecessary. After a moment, I reached into a folder I had placed beside me earlier that evening. I slid a set of documents across the table toward him. He looked down in confusion before reading the title printed at the top. Divorce petition. The room became silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was calm and steady, not tense or uncertain. Grant slowly raised his eyes toward me, clearly surprised by what he was seeing. I remained composed. For the first time in a very long while, I wasn't reacting to his decisions or waiting for his approval. I was simply choosing the direction of my own life. After I handed over the papers, Grant remained quiet for several minutes. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. I didn't mean the things I said all those years, he began. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. I listened without interruption. There was a flicker of regret in his eyes, but I could see clearly that his words couldn't undo what had already happened. The truth was simple. The struggles, the late nights, the self-doubt, and the challenges I had faced, they had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who no longer depended on his approval to feel worthy. The woman he once dismissed as ordinary, the one he thought would never achieve anything remarkable, was now living a life full of purpose, independence, and respect. Every project I led, every recognition I earned, and every opportunity one seized had built a version of me he could neither control nor belittle. Grant's apology felt almost irrelevant because it wasn't the words themselves but the journey I had taken that mattered. The experiences, the determination, and the courage I discovered along the way had already transformed me. For the first time, I understood that my life didn't need his validation or recognition. I was no longer confined by the limits he had tried to place on me. As I packed my things to move forward, a lightness settled over me. It wasn't anger or bitterness that filled me, it was something much stronger. I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't experienced in years. The weight of trying to please someone who couldn't see my worth lifted completely. In that moment, I realized something important. Revenge might have been satisfying, but it wasn't necessary. The true triumph lay in reclaiming myself. I stepped into the next chapter of my life with confidence, certainty, and peace. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something more powerful than hurt or anger. I felt completely free. Do you think I did the right thing by leaving Grant, or should I have tried to fix our marriage? I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you like stories like mine, subscribe and hit the bell.